What a treat I have for you on the show today. One of the most perspicacious football analysts you're going to find. Good old friend of the show. One half of the Seattle Overload podcast team, along with Matty Brown. Griffin Sturgeon joining me today to provide his outstanding insight into several aspects of the Seahawks' initial 53-man roster. But in particular, today we're going to talk about the inside linebacker position. He didn't feel that great about the position shortly after the draft and into free agency. How does he feel about it now? Do the Seahawks potentially have some young pieces in place long-term? Griffin Sturgeon joining me today on Seahawks Forever.
Welcome to the Seahawks Forever podcast. In-depth analysis on everything Seahawks. And now, here's your host, Dan Viens.
Happy college football kickoff day today. I know there have been some random games up until this point, but the floodgates open today. And whether you're a Coug like me or a Husky fan, you've got games to watch today. All sorts of marquee matchups today, which I will be getting to shortly. Until then, if you like this video, hit that thumbs up button on the YouTube channel, subscribe to the Seahawks Forever YouTube channel, and hit that bell for notification of future episodes. And all the other ways you can support the show are listed down below in the description. Appreciate you watching and appreciate all the support. It's certainly been an offseason of transition at the inside linebacker position for the Seahawks as they move on from their former first-round pick in Jordan Brooks and future Hall of Famer Bobby Wagner in the same offseason. Wagner for the second time. They go out and they sign Terrell Dodson and Jerome Baker in free agency. Haven't had a chance to see Baker yet. He's been hurt. Don't know if or how much he's going to play against the Broncos. They draft a player. They acquire another player in a trade. They devote a roster spot to another player who they acquired in a waiver wire pickup last year, who's been flying under the radar. And to give us thoughts on all of them, as only he can, is Griffin. Here's my conversation with him earlier today. Well, Griffin, sorry to tear you away from Georgia and Clemson and all the other things going on at this hour as we record this big day in college football, which means you get to start scouting the 2025 class. Thanks for taking the time to hop on again.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. I always enjoy coming on and chatting with you.
It's always good to have you and your perspective, because what you and Matty do on the Seattle Overload podcast is, I say it every time you have on. It's sometimes it's a language that I feel like I'm not fluent in, but I learn something every time I listen to you guys talk, and I know my viewers do too. And rather than like fall into the trap of I want to get your take on everything that's happening with this team, we are going to focus today on one particular position group that you've spent you've spent a bunch of time focusing on inside linebackers ever since going back to the draft class because of need and because it was kind of a thin class and required a little bit of extra work. And so I want to focus on that. But first, I'm interested to hear your general thoughts when you saw the makeup of the 53-man roster, which here 4 days later now has undergone really no changes. Right. Which is surprising in and of itself. So the construction of the initial 53-man roster, what are some of your takeaways on the overall list?
Looking at the roster and extracting what you can from preseason, they feel extremely strong at D-line. They're obviously really strong in the middle, but I think their edge group is pretty underrated. As well as, they've got room for improvement too via the inherent youth between Derek Hollenboy and Mafe. I think those two guys are ascending players. We saw a huge jump from Mafe as well. And then I think they're really talented on the perimeter. I think their cornerback room has upfront talent and talent down the depth chart, as well as like a really cool, intriguing diversity of skill sets. And then the safety room, I had some concerns about the safety room, but the more I've gotten into Kayvon Wallace, I think he's a really cool addition. I think he's the type of player that really could be the most talented safety and most effective safety on the team. And I already feel fairly highly of Rayshawn Jenkins as it is. And I probably had maybe a more negative view of Julian Love than most people did, but I liked him his preceding year in New York. So in theory, if he bounces back to what I think he can be, like they have a really competent safety room there. So I think those are the strengths of the team, corner and D-line. As you said, there are questions about linebackers. Previously, I would have said maybe to theatrically concerns, but I might dial that down to just kind of an open question mark instead. I think there's a path for it being better than what my preconceived notion was. But yeah, so I feel like they're really strong on the defensive side of the ball at D-line and corner. And then on the offensive side of the ball, it's kind of what we already know. It's like the quarterback situation, receiver situation is really strong. Then the O-line, again, is a huge question mark. And it's just like, are they going to stay healthy? Is Connor Williams, if he is who he's been to this point in his career day one, then that's a huge boon for the whole group that will rise all tides. So there's definitely room for, I think they have a strong floor, and then there's definitely a viable path for them reaching their ceiling, which is, I think, ultimately pretty high.
One of the things that really stood out, at least to me, and I know it's gotten a lot of traction since then, is the 11 offensive linemen, and maybe as much as any year that we've seen over the last 15 or so, there seems a pretty concerted interest in protecting the young offensive linemen that they feel have a chance to develop. And it's a commitment that we haven't seen them make for a long time. Were you surprised to see them keep LaMea, Gerald, all of those guys and protect them?
Well, those guys played well in preseason, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think additionally, like you said, there's kind of like a youth movement in the depth. I think that correlates with a new coaching staff coming in, them wanting to form a 2-3 year long relationship with them. The best O-lines around the league, their interior starters were on the bench for a year or two. I mean, that's the Green Bay model. That's been the Rams model. The Seahawks, I think Schneider, obviously he comes from the Ron Wolf model, right? So he's aware of that. I think he tried to get into that world starting a couple of years ago. Phil Haynes didn't work out, but like that was the right intention. He's a mid-round pick. You wait till year 3, see what happens. So Bradford, I think like they're doing the right thing with Bradford. Like they're not just giving the right guard to Haynes or to Christian Haynes, that is. And maybe he's improved and we'll earn that spot, and we'll see what happens there. Damian Lewis probably he probably had his best year last year, at least once he got healthy. And he was kind of solid from the jump, but it's like guards need that development period, right? So I like that Laumea and Gerald and Sundel are sticking around. I was really impressed with Laumea, I'll say, in preseason. I think he's going to be a starting guard here in pretty short order. That's if I'm going to plant a flag on any one of those guys, I really like Laumea. So yeah, I like that. That's kind of been their philosophy there. I think that's the right move to take. If it doesn't work, fine, but I still think it's a good process.
Speaking of right guard, Mike McDonald kind of threw that up into the ether a couple of days ago by saying that they haven't decided on that yet. We're going to wait and announce it, keep the Broncos guessing, which calls into question whether or not Christian Haynes might have made a late, lean into the yellow tape at the end of the race, right? Who do you expect to see starting at right guard against the Broncos?
I think they're going to give the nod to Bradford week 1. And I think it's going to be one of those things where we're going to see a Haynes drive toward the end of the game. And we're going to see 2 Haynes drives against the Patriots. And they're going to keep assessing as they go. For continuity's sake, that is pretty disruptive. But I think for the long term, that's the right move to make, because otherwise, how is Haynes really supposed to? How are you supposed to know what you have with him, right? I mean, you want to see him to get live reps. Part of it always for guards is like, and really any line of scrimmage position, it's even though he's an older rookie, they need NFL reps. Like it doesn't matter how quick you are, it doesn't matter how good of a processor you were in college. You can't adjust to NFL speed without NFL reps. So a lot of these guys can have like a lag effect in their development. It's because they just need to like see NFL action. The same thing goes for Derek Hall. Last year, all of his traits were on tape, but it's functionally, he wasn't quick. Functionally, he wasn't strong, even though you see him jacking a guy back 3 yards. He just needs to adjust to NFL's pacing. And so I think that will be the same thing with Haynes. But I think it'll be Bradford to start, and then I think Haynes will trickle in, and then they'll make a decision at some point.
We're all, of course, hoping for the return to health of Abe Lucas at some point, and John Schneider shed some light on that with a little more clarity the other day than we've heard for a while, and actually is optimistic that we will see a fully healthy Abe Lucas at some point this year. But in the meantime, were you able to see enough, given who he was playing against and opportunities he got in the preseason, of Mike Jarrell to get a determination at all or a feel for whether you think he could develop into a starting right tackle in this league?
With him, it's fun. It's funny because he kind of mirrors the guy that they brought in to hedge against Lucas, George Fant, right? He's high effort athletic project. So he just needs time. So given that, I mean, in theory, yeah, he could. I don't know if I've seen that yet. I feel like it would be way too much too soon to get him out there with the ones right now. But they kept him on the roster for a reason, and I'm going to defer to Scott Huff and what he thinks he can work with there. In time, we'll see. I think the door is open, though, for sure. He definitely has the traits. He has the foot speed, and a lot of the premium tackles in the league, they're premium because the traits are there, and then the technique always follows, if indeed they end up becoming one of the top tackles. But the litmus test are the traits, and he definitely has the traits. So from there, we'll see what happens. But I mean, like he's a big man that is strong, explosive, and he can bend his knees. And there are a lot of guys that get drafted in the first round that are explosive and strong and stuff, but they can't bend their knees, and a lot of their athleticism becomes kind of maybe nullified when they have to reshape their body throughout a snap. Because in the NFL, you might get your hands on a guy, or in college, you might get your hands on a guy and kill the rush from the edge rusher. In the NFL, it's not always the case because everyone's got, second and third and fourth efforts within a snap. So can the tackle himself have the second, third, and fourth efforts? Jarrell has the physical makeup for it. So he's definitely a guy that I'm intrigued by, but it's just, time's got to unfurl itself, and then we'll see.
It's interesting. You mentioned technique. The tale of two small school guys, McClendon Curtis, played at Chattanooga. Figured prominently in the preseason at a number of different positions, and then Mike Jarrell comes out of Findlay, and I feel like Jarrell's footwork and technique is light years better than McClendon Curtis. And maybe that was kind of ultimately one of the things that led to him making the roster and Curtis not. And just a side note for those, because I have had some listeners and viewers ask me, are we taking a risk? Are we risking roster spots that could be used at other positions by basically redshirting a couple of young offensive linemen? And I would remind those people that the Seahawks carried Raekwon O'Neal and McClendon Curtis on their 53-man roster all last year, and they didn't really get any playing time at all just because they liked their upside and wanted to protect those guys. So it can be done. Right. Back to the other side of the ball, and before we get to the inside guys, I want to get your thoughts on essentially the swap last week of Darrell Taylor for Trevis Gibson. Taylor going to the Bears, and then Gibson being acquired from Jacksonville. Different body types, but playing the same position. Is that an upgrade to go from Taylor to Gibson?
I'm not entirely sure. I was fairly agnostic about the Taylor move itself. I liked Taylor in the draft. I thought his first year was really exciting. Obviously, as we all know, his run defense fell off the face of the earth in 2022, and then it didn't really bounce back. To his credit, I thought he played with a little more vigor this past preseason, but it might be a case of too little, too late. As an edge rusher, we know that if it's second and long, third and long, Darrell Taylor is going to bring some heat, at least on those deep arc rushes on tackles. He'll get his pressures. May not convert a lot of them to sacks, but he'll definitely kind of cap the pocket. But in a perfect world, he's only playing 300, 400 snaps for you, and they're going to have a heavy rotation. Gibson, at the very worst, isn't going to be that much worse of an edge rusher, and I think he gives a little bit more in the run game. Just his body type provides a little bit more of an anchor. So we're talking about the guy that's going to get you the fourth or fifth most edge snaps ultimately, right? So it's if the coaching staff just isn't feeling it with Taylor, you might as well cycle in another guy and see if he sticks. And ultimately they're like in the same ballpark of talent and total value. So try your hand with a slightly differently styled guy and see what happens there.
All right, so let's get to the task at hand, which is catching up on your thoughts on the inside linebacker position. This was one that as I watched you break down prospects throughout the draft process, you seem to be focusing a little more intently on. And at one point you published a list about 11 or 12 players deep of some of the top prospects in the draft and whether or not you thought they were scheme fits and how much you liked each of them. When the Seahawks drafted Tyrice Knight out of UTEP, you didn't love his film. Right. And as we sit here today, I can't get your thoughts on what you think of Jerome Baker's performance in the preseason because we haven't seen him yet on the field. We may see him against Denver, but we haven't seen him yet, not in a Seattle uniform. And so that meant a lot of reps for Knight with the first team running beside Terrell Dotson.
Right.
How do you feel about him now based on what you've seen in the preseason versus when he was coming out?
Yeah, well, for full disclosure, before like any baggage that gets developed once guys become Seahawks, any sort of narrative forms, my earnest, honest opinion based off of the 4 games of all 22 I watched of Tyrice Knight, I ended up watching 18 guys. My honest opinion, right or wrong, was that he was the worst guy that I watched. And I'm thinking like, okay, he's going to be a late day three guy. Never, ever did I think that the Seahawks would be calling his name, especially in the 4th round. And I think most people, even the people that were like willing to take an optimistic view, which is, I think, you should always attempt to, right? Just for the sake of the exercise. I think most people still didn't expect him to go in the 4th. So immediately when they picked him, I'm like, okay, I'm trying to reconcile the fact that based off of what I think of him and that this coaching staff and generally the scouts, I believe, know what they're doing. And I'm always going to default to like, okay, they always know more than we think they know. So how is this? How do I reconcile my opinion and obviously their high opinion of it? And so what I would say is every player has a sample of bad reps and good reps in their tape, right? And I think an optimist is going to isolate their good reps and go, okay, we can build out of that. We can see the underlying traits that makes those good reps common to one another, like what's the common denominator, and then we can grow out of that. And then the bad stuff, well, we can try to cull that away and everything. So if I were to approach it with that lens and watching his tape, the scheme that UTEP played in is incredibly hard for a linebacker. So it's so easy to screw up, basically. And what that means is, at least in his case at UTEP, they always fit the run down a gap. So if there are 6 blockers forming 7 gaps, they're assigning 6 defenders for 7 gaps. So that means that at the second level, especially when they're in their 4 down fronts, those 2 second level linebackers, if they're nickels, say, they have to distribute the responsibility of 3 gaps to 2 guys. That's extremely hard. Like that's like a different scheme overall, but that's kind of like the classic Monty Kiffin Tampa 2 stuff. Think Brian Urlacher, Lance Briggs. And even then, like, even though that was their base way of playing it, they slanted the line, they run blitz, they stunted so much to take themselves out of their base way of playing to make it feasible. Then you add in the threat of play action. So you've got that extra gap, and like, oh, it's not even a run, now a run play. Now I have to go look over my shoulder to find those crossing routes, those benders, those posts. I mean, it's impossible. So putting that on a 20-year-old on a bad team, on a team that has 2- and 3-star recruits, there's going to be a lot of room for screwing up. And so when you task them with so much responsibility, I would imagine, this is me projecting, but I would imagine you're also not playing super confident. So there are some moments where he has some really unflattering plays, like with 2-way goes or whatever, or he's got to make a play in space or something. And he just, honestly, he doesn't look like an athlete in those situations. But I imagine like he's probably not feeling like, all right, I know exactly what I have to do. There's so much thinking involved. Mm-hmm. If we remember Pete Carroll, his whole like philosophy was like, make it as easy on the players as possible to know exactly what they need to do. Even if he didn't succeed in doing that, that was the intent. McDonald is similar in that he wants them to know exactly what they want to do and wants it to look complex for the offense, simple for the defense. So through that lens, that said, he has a similar philosophy where he in run fitting as UTEP, where they're fitting down a gap a lot. He does a lot more to try to make it a little bit easier on them. Maybe he simplifies the teaching for it. But so I think he identified Knight and said, this guy already speaks my language. UTEP is perhaps not well coached. He's not surrounded by a lot of talent. I could start with him, and in time, maybe he can get to where I need him to be as an athlete. I mean, he has a good weight density. He has a good density, I think, 6 foot, 235. In the NFL right now, that's on the heavier side for linebackers. And he ran a 4.6, which is not fast, but it's not slow. So 4.6 at 235. I mean, you can work with that. So that said, in preseason, what I referred to as ball fitting, where you're down a gap. They did not scheme that way. That said, they kept it more simple. They used what are called gap fits. So if there are 6 blockers, 7 gaps, they're fitting it with 7 defenders. So one defender for every gap. Of the things that are kind of meant to be a little bit more streamlined and easier for them, his performance in that was pretty good. They had a couple of drives where they did the more pure form 2023 Baltimore stuff, and it didn't look good. But it didn't look good not just for him. Everyone kind of struggled with it. So, but the stuff where it's like downhill, what he can see, I thought he defended quite well. And I am immediately amending my undrafted free agent, pre-draft opinion. And I'm like, okay, this looks like a 4th rounder now. Like his floor is that of a 4th rounder. Okay. Let's see in time, where can he take that?
Yeah. It's always interesting to hear someone that's open-minded enough about their evaluation process to change their mind. I remember a very similar thing happened in regards to Jaron Reed, where his Green Bay tape was terrible, and you were one of the first people to point that out. But they put him in position to succeed, and he has done that so far.
He was the second most. Yeah, he was awesome last year. So
do you now see a solid, at least a solid long-term starting piece of the puzzle there at that position for the Seahawks?
So at weak side linebacker specifically, so in watching Jerome Baker last year, I wasn't a fan of his tape, but the preceding year, 2022, I liked it a lot. He was hurt last year. They had a DC change. I'm not a fan of how Vic Fangio is using his linebackers in general right now. So I'm kind of willing to throw 23 in the trash and just focus on his 2022 stuff. I think Baker's solid. I think he's firmly above average linebacker at will. Tyrice Knight, I think, can eventually inherit the position if that's what they want to do contract-wise. You can always make the cool thing about weak side linebacker in a 2-high scheme is that, and really for a 1-high scheme as well, but you can control how much that position matters. So if your player is really, really good, you can scheme as though he's really, really good and ask him to do harder stuff for the benefit of your defense. If he isn't that good, or if it's just there's rungs of value, you can scheme accordingly, and it doesn't have to hurt your overall picture. It's a lot harder to fake it at Mike. If you have a middle linebacker that doesn't do a lot in coverage, your whole coverage palette starts to shrink. Your menu starts to shrink. That's kind of what we experienced with Bobby Wagner last year, the Hall of Famer. But last year, maybe the year before that, he's not offering what he once did.
Right.
What you can call, it ties a DC's hands. So at Mike, that's where I have big questions. Dodson, he signed a $4 million contract, right? So it's not like they're pinning their hopes and dreams on this guy. But I know he has a high PFF grade in coverage. I think part of that is attributable to the fact that he was asked to do very low difficulty, low value things. And then if you squint for the stuff where he's asked to do slightly harder things, I wasn't really a fan of what I was seeing. The Bills tape space, they kind of have a consensus opinion of him. They describe him as a run thumper on early downs, that on third downs, you're looking for an excuse to take him off the field. They had a lot of injuries, and he climbed the depth chart because of that. But then even then, they were playing dime to take him off the field in passing situations. So that said, though, he played a full drive in the final preseason game, and it's only 8 snaps, but he did things in that one drive that I have not seen him do in Buffalo at all. Not even, it's one thing to say he did this poorly in Buffalo, but you can still cherry pick good plays. I could not even cherry pick the good plays to post and be like, okay, here's an example of him doing it. Maybe he'll do this better. It was like a night and day transformation. Now, granted, preseason, only one drive. You're not playing all the starters of the Browns offense, et cetera, right? But getting depth in his hook, knowing where the inbreakers are coming, finding the crossing route, almost got a pick for crying out loud. Yeah. So insofar as one preseason game can counterbalance an entire season's worth of tape from a well-coached Bills team last year, I have an open mind for him being better than what I thought he was. But I'm still going to weigh a full season's of tape last year, right? But it's like, all right, well, if one preseason game can change the heart and minds of a naysayer, then then maybe it can. But yeah, so it's more like touch and go for me there. But it's perhaps the linebacker position, to summarize, is maybe not the disaster that I thought it was.
Good to hear. And then another surprise at that position too. It's the second half of the Cleveland game on Saturday, and I'm texting with a buddy, and he says, "Hey, is that Drake Thomas wearing the green dot?" And indeed it was. Thomas was playing Mike wearing the green dot, Patrick, I think alongside Patrick O'Connell for much of the second half there. Thomas was a guy that when they poached him off the Raiders practice squad last year, I loved some of the stuff he had on tape coming out of NC State. I was really excited about that little move. And then he got the knee injury late in the year, and none of us really knew how severe it was, but obviously it was, because he starts training camp on PUP. And then kind of out of nowhere 2 weeks ago, he shows up at practice one day. Like, reporters weren't even expecting it. Now he's playing in the third preseason game, and then he makes the final roster. How did he fly under the radar? How did we miss on Drake Thomas? What are you seeing from him?
You know, I suspect that it was a special teams thing. Radigan was probably circled as not ever really going to factor into the linebacker situation. He was always a special teamer, and a good one. Yeah. I think that's probably the case with Drake Thomas right now, but he is athletic. I think it makes sense to round out your roster with a guy that has, strictly speaking, potential due to his athleticism, and let your other depth players kind of be like the solid, serviceable type. So I think they got Patrick O'Connell on the practice squad. He's kind of like that solid, serviceable guy who you're not going to, the sky won't be falling if he has to play a drive or two. But yeah, so with Thomas, I'm not seeing anything in particular that is like, look out for this personally, but I mean, it's more of a anything is possible type of deal, and you might as well take a swing on a guy, especially if they're offering a lot in on special teams. So,
and I want to get your thoughts on Michael Barrett. There was some nervous moments when he was released because he didn't sign immediately back to the practice squad. There's a little bit of a delay there, but they acquire him last week for Mike Jackson. He's got the history, played for Mike McDonald his 1 year at Michigan, although he was just a rotational player at the time. So a guy that's got scheme familiarity, and certainly Jay Harbaugh would know him as well. He's another guy that has a reputation for being outstanding on special teams. What have you been able to see there from some of the reps he played in Carolina? And I know you studied him coming out of Michigan, and I think he was, well, we know he was higher than Knight on your list of linebackers that you evaluated because Knight was last. But I think that you had some positive thoughts about Barrett. One scouting report that really stuck with me about him even before the draft, and I can't remember who it was, one of the big name guys. It might have been Daniel Jeremiah, who said his tape against Alabama last year was the best inside linebacker tape he saw all year long. Your thoughts on Barrett? Did end up getting back on the practice squad for the Hawks.
Yeah, I love Michael Barrett. I was probably a little too bullish on him. I think I had him ranked like the 4th or 5th guy in the class.
You said he was a Seahawk fit, I remember from your notes.
Yeah. And like you said, the Michigan thing, like he knows all the techniques that are used, the eye progressions, like the play calls, what all the linebackers are required to do. The general like draw. I'll start with like the main drawback is that as an athlete, he's a below average athlete. Now he ran at his pro day a 4.62. There are a lot of linebackers in the league right now running 4.6s that are quality players. I think it's more like the initial burst with him, like the immediate explosiveness isn't there. Once he gets going full stride, I don't think he's like disqualifyingly slow. I think his short area quickness is decent, but I will say also it looked like Carolina had him gain weight, or maybe he gained weight out of his own accord. I don't think he needs to play in the league at 240. I think he should be back down to his Michigan weight, about 230. And I think that's probably the sweet spot for him. He is a really interesting player. If we're just evaluating, because when we watch college players, we think of them as prospects and not college players, right? As a college football player, just trying to grade what he did for his team, he was the best linebacker I watched all year. Wow. Last year for Michigan. I thought he was a better, more valuable football player than Junior Colson, who Junior Colson's a better prospect. I would take Junior Colson over Barrett in a heartbeat. But as a football player in that moment in time, Barrett is providing more for that Wolverines defense than I thought his running mate was. So What kind of player is he? He's always assignment correct. He's never wrong. I mean, he knows what's going. He's like reverse engineering the offensive play off of one or two keys, and he knows exactly what to do without looking at it. When he's zone dropping, he knows where the in-breaking routes are. He knows where to, if my immediate threat is eliminated, where am I going? There's a guy that he reminds me of when he does that stuff. It's KJ Wright as a zone dropper. His eyes are always going to the next thing. He even does some kind of stuff in coverage that you might call like extra credit, where he's eliminated all the threats he would, and then his eyes get to the other side of the field, and he's making a play in coverage that Colson would make. And what I mean by like making a play, it doesn't always mean batting a ball down. It means getting in the window of a guy that would otherwise break your play call, break your scheme, where like no one's done anything wrong per se. It's just a scheme beater, which, you know, you'll see on occasion, even the Michigan defense. And he relieves that stress spot. And it's just like, wow, it's KJ Wright that I've seen do stuff like that. In run defense, he was played at 5'11", 232, but guards cannot block him. He will stack and shed a guy 80 pounds heavier than him. I don't know how he does it, but like I've posted clips. I don't know if you've seen them, but it's like he is getting in a guy's grill, stacking, shedding, and peeking into his gap, winning back the space in his gap and being available for the play. And I'm just like, I don't know how he's doing this right now. I watched his Carolina tape in preseason. He didn't play very many snaps. All the run stuff translated, I'll say. Yeah. So he's got some reps of just jacking back a guard and making a positive play for the defense. I didn't see him really make a single mistake, but in coverage, he wasn't really challenged. So his coverage tape, it's not that it's good or bad. It's more like NA, not applicable, just because the way those plays played out, they're not informative in any one direction. But I think it's cool that, he came into the Seahawks kind of behind, right? Just by virtue of how late in the process. So I hope that he eventually gets called up and can maybe earn some playing time in a blowout and just see what's there. But I imagine he'll be one of those guys that is like a coach's favorite, just because he's the things that he can control, the takes no talent stuff. He's like 10 out of 10. So
now if we're count me as a Barrett guy. Good. Sorry. If we're projecting way ahead, right? Yeah. We're looking 2-3 years ahead. And being optimistic and wishing on, the upside that we have in that linebacker room right now, do the skill sets of Barrett and Knight fit together? Can those two guys be on the field at the same time and maybe be something that's part of a core?
I would move Knight to Mike in that hypothetical. I would need to see. So with Knight in preseason to this point, he's handling the stuff that he can see well. It's the stuff that he can't see well, the stuff that's going on behind him, I guess, where you have to infer what is happening. That I think if you're to nitpick his preseason stuff, like he's not handling play action great. When you've got dig routes going over the top of him, you have to know when they're coming and where they're hitting relative to what the quarterback is doing. Like when you're zone dropping and you're supposed to have eyes on the quarterback, you're not looking at the routes. You're playing a zone technique. You still have to know what's going on behind you, so you're not just a sitting duck. Otherwise, you're a traffic cone. Like spot dropping is really calling it spot dropping is a disservice. You're always in motion. If you're not constantly performing like maintenance on your zone drop relative to what the offense is doing pre-snap and post-snap, you're not giving much to your defense. So, but that said, that stuff is really hard, and it takes linebackers a while to get there. So I'm not going to hold that against him for not being able to do that yet, but that will be the thing I'll be looking for. So how does he handle the hard stuff, I guess? And if he starts to show those signs, I mean, if Dodson is doing it through, that based off of one preseason game, then theoretically you can get a guy 4 years younger than him to do that as well with even more time to coach him, right? And athletically, he and Dodson are kind of working with the same tools. They're both 4'6" guys, maybe have average change of direction, but they have good play strength and they're high effort. What can you do with, what can a good coaching staff do with that? How far can they take that? So we'll have to see. Demario Davis, what did he run, a 4.7? He's been one of the best linebackers in the league for a decade. Yeah. So, it's right. So we'll just have to wait and see. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility, though. I mean, it's feasible, I'd say.
As you look at this defense as a whole, obviously we saw very, very vanilla execution of the defense for the most part during the preseason. He rushed 4 on just about every snap. There's going to be some growing pains. Greg Bell told me just a couple of days ago that the defense isn't even 100% installed there. How long do you anticipate it taking before we start to see, start to see the defense come together in the way that we hope and expect?
I think there's enough has been shown right now that the fundamentals will at least translate. And I think the fundamentals will translate, and the scheme itself is inherently sound, that I don't think that there will be a lot of like big play variance that will hurt them. And I don't think that they'll also be able to necessarily create big plays for their favor either. So I guess what that means is I think they're going to start out competent and not necessarily super flashy, but they're not going to get walked all over. I don't think they're going to dominate teams either, but I think they're just, I think go ahead.
Do you expect him to play kind of close to the vest and be a little conservative coming out of the gate, or do you think he's going to throw everything that he has at the rookie quarterback, Bo Nix?
So that's interesting. I mean, he's definitely going to be dialing up the sim pressures where he's sending a second level guy and dropping a first level guy pretty much, right? We're definitely going to see a lot of that. I think the coverage diversity will be kind of narrow maybe. Again, it depends on what he trusts Dodson with, what he trusts Knight with, or Baker if we see them. Yeah. I could see, I mean, on that note, to offset that, he might lean even more into the disguise. I mean, the way I see their defensive roster, he was a too high disguise team last year. When you play too high, I mean, you still need your corners to play well, but you're distributing the responsibility on your back seven kind of evenly. When you play a lot of zone, you play a lot of too high. When he wanted to accentuate his corners, he would play cover one, so man coverage, but still, all in all, they were more of a too high team. You can make your cover three stuff be more mimic man coverage, like cover three zone match and stuff. I think with his current roster, I think the more responsibility he places on his corners and the less responsibility he places on his linebackers, the better to start. So I wouldn't be shocked if he comes out being a one high team. And that means even more man coverage, even more tight match cover three, the type of cover three where you're not asking your linebackers to gain a lot of depth in coverage. They can just kind of hug the running back, and just choosing to fall on that sword, or rather live and die by that sword. So maybe that means less too high and more one high. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, I have no idea what week one's going to look like. I don't think preseason is going to tip a lot in terms of actual scheme, because he did play more one high in preseason than he did in Baltimore. So maybe that actually will translate. I'm saying I don't know, but I'm very eager to see what it looks like. I do think that he gives Bo Nix a hard time though.
A lot of talk about the lack of a true backup nose tackle or anyone else of that body style and build behind Jonathan Hankins. There was some thought that they'd be looking for that at the waiver wire or at the cut down date. They haven't done anything there. Can they, obviously Cam Young, once he's finally healthy, he's going to have to miss 4 games now, will factor into that. Can they get by between now and then? Or do you still think that they're lacking one more kind of sturdier interior defensive tackle?
I think they're okay with having a lighter brand of nose play. Last year, the run defense problems, I don't source it to like the interior defensive tackle spots. Jaron Reed played nose tackle, as we know, one technique at 305, 10 pounds, whatever he is. And I don't think that they were giving up those runs they gave up because of him. So I think that between Hankins and Reed and Byron Murphy, who can play nose tackle, his own brand, his own style of it, I think they're fine, honestly. I really don't think that they need to bring in a Hankins mirror. If they do, it might just be because they like that player and they want to hedge against Hankins' age and youth, or age and whatever workload he can accommodate. So, but I'm not too pressed about the nose tackle position overall.
Today, before I let you go, I'm curious to know, as you're watching college football today, and I can't remember an opening Saturday with as many marquee matchups. Like I'm busy. I'm booked the rest of the day. Like, I'm just going to be sitting in front of the TV after I get this edited. How do you watch college football when you're watching live games? Do you go in with an agenda, a list of players that you know or prospects you want to look at from each team, or do you just kind of let it come to you and wait for players to flash?
You know, during the fall, I just kind of embraced the narratives and just kind of let the college football, drama wash over me. And then as the season goes on, names will start to get hyped up, like, okay, I should watch this guy more critically. So I'm always late to the game when it comes to prospects. Occasionally a guy will like stick out in mind. I'll be like, all right, this is one of my favorites, so I'll watch him. But then that will work against me, right? Because you form that notion about a guy, he becomes your favorite. And then when you dive in a little bit more thoroughly, you start to realize, oh, he's not as good as this other guy. And so I have to come down off of my infatuation with this guy and be more unbiased about it, right? So I end up forming biases always, and then I have to unwork those biases throughout like January, February, March period. But yeah, I kind of just watch it as a fan, really. I am a Husky fan, so it's through that lens. I'm not as big of a Husky fan as I am a Seahawks fan, though, full disclosure. So yeah, but no, I don't have like a thorough process or anything.
Well, now you got to shift your focus, because after 15 years of probably instantly being able to watch a live game and identify that looks like a Pete Carroll guy, right? Especially when you talk about secondary players and some of those edge players. And now you have to look for a different style, right?
Right. Exactly.
Well, thanks, Griffin. Time always flies when I have you on the show. Always love your input and your thoughts. You and Matty Brown do such a great job on the Seattle Overload podcast. Tell everybody where they can find that and what you guys have coming up on the show.
Appreciate the kind words, and likewise. And yeah, Matty and I are doing, I think, Saturday and or Sunday only episodes now, just because our schedules are being rearranged. You can find us Seattle Overload wherever you get your podcasts. We also stream live on YouTube, so you can catch the reruns there as well. And yeah.
Awesome. I'll put your guys' Twitter handles down below and the link to your page as well. Thanks, Griffin. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thanks, man. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Once again, my buddy Steve. The song is Dopamine. The band is Stephen Douglas and Company. Check it out on Spotify. He's got a new EP out there. How are you feeling heading into the opener about the inside linebacker position in Seattle, based on what you saw in the preseason, based on what analysis you may have read or viewed elsewhere, and what Griffin had to say? Give me your thoughts down below. Certainly, it's still a position that, as any of them are really this time of year, that I'm going to be watching some of those guys. It is purportedly a better class projected for the 2025 draft at inside linebacker. Just this morning, watching a little bit of Georgia and Clemson, watching Barrett Carter. There are some intriguing guys. And I think this draft has a few more of the sort of throwback type, bigger inside linebackers, which may still be a need as the Seahawks look towards next year's draft. Again, down below in the description, I'll link the Seattle Overload podcast if you haven't checked it out yet, so you can find it, as well as Griffin and Matty's Twitter handles. Mine is at Seahawks Forever. Please follow me there. Subscribe to the channel once again, and support the show by checking out the links down below. Thank you again. We're getting there, you guys. Just 8 more days as I sit here today. Next up on Seahawks Forever on Monday, Jessamine McIntyre of KJR Radio is going to be joining me to give her thoughts on this team heading into the Broncos. We'll start to look ahead sort of formally and preview that game. Also, Curtis Allen's going to be joining me early next week from the Seahawks Draft Blog. He's going to break down, as only he can, all of the Seattle Seahawks salary cap parameters, kind of where they sit now, how next year looks, some big decisions they have coming up, and some things that they could do between now and the trade deadline potentially. And then we'll be previewing the Bronco game in proper as we move into the week as well. Again, I'm Dan. This is Seahawks Forever. Thanks for watching. Forever and always, go Hawks.
Just a shot of dopamine is all I really need. Just a shot of dopamine will make me so happy. Just a shot of dopamine is all I really need. You lift me